Today's episode is brought to you by Modern Grower. Modern Grower is your source for time and labor-saving farm tools, such as the Paper Pot Transplanter, Quick Click Seeder, and the Jang Direct Seeder. Turn laborsome tasks into free time with tools by Modern Grower. So, David, a lot of the work that you've done over the course of your career has been on drylands. How would you define drylands?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think we've traditionally tended to define dry lands based on climate. So landscapes that are semi-arid or arid, meaning they get less than about 500 millimeters or what's that, 20 inches of rainfall. They're generally hot, but our kind of thinking about dry lands has changed a little bit over the last few decades, and we're thinking that there's also a human aspect to drylands, what makes a landscape a dryland. But in general, they're generally not cultivated. They're generally rangeland, we might say, or grazing lands or forestry. You can look at drylands through different lenses, but essentially they're landscapes that are quite harsh, that support 40% of the Earth's population, occur over nearly 40% of the terrestrial landscape of the planet. And there are areas where there's a lot of conflict. There's a lot of poor people. There's a lot of warfare. There's a lot of fighting over water. Pretty exciting landscapes.
What's the big misconception you think people have around them, or what's changed maybe throughout the course of your career in terms of how people view drylands?
I think this kind of touches on the term desertification or degradation. And we've tended to think of drylands as climatically driven. So they're dry because there's not enough rainfall, or it's too hot, or the evaporation is greater than the precipitation. Really, like I said before, there's a human element, and humans are one of the big drivers of drylands. They overgraze, they overcultivate where they shouldn't, they cut firewood, they do a lot of things that cause landscapes that probably weren't drylands 1,000 years ago to move into what we might call drylands now, these sort of fairly fragile, degraded, semi-arid and arid systems.
Are you a proponent of theories like Alan Savory has, where you can regenerate drylands, bring them back to a more pastoral state through human interaction in a positive way?
I don't see what Alan Savory does as particularly positive. There's a lot of debate about Savory and his what's the term? I can't remember now.
Holistic management?
Oh yeah, the changes that it was holistic resource management, then it was holistic management, now it's something else. I think, look, we could talk for ages about the system, but there are some good things about holistic management, and that is take care of the land, look after the land, think about what your family wants, plan for the future, look at the ecology. But there's also a lot of things about the Savory system that are damaging, that you can double your stocking rate and earn more money, that you got to beat the crap out of the soil because the soil crust is holding succession. There's a lot of misconception about Savory, and that when Savory appeared on the TED Talks, that created a lot of controversy, and it really polarized the community into two groups: the scientists who've never been able to show using reduction of science that Savory's system has worked, and then those producers, and not all producers, but some producers that feel that they like the idea that you can increase stocking rates and grazing capacity and make more money from the land. So I'm not an exponent of the exponent. Is that the right word? I'm not a fan of the Savory system, and neither are most of my rangeland colleagues in Australia. And I know that in the US and Africa, it's highly contested. And one of the reasons was that Savory developed his system in South Africa, where rainfall is regular. You know what's going to happen next month. You can plan. But when you're in a system that we have in Australia, where rainfall is highly variable, the coefficient of variation, the variability in rainfall is quite high. So you can't really plan what's going to happen in 6 months' time. You've got to take advantage of opportunities that arise. If it's a big rainfall year, you might put on more livestock. If it's a low rainfall year, you take off livestock. So a system that's based on moving livestock around, which might work in Africa, is not very effective in Australia. And that's one of the issues of Savory. And when Savory's questioned over this, He says, oh, you didn't move the livestock quick enough. Oh, you've got the wrong size paddock. Oh, you didn't use water enough. Oh, you didn't do this, you didn't do that. It's very difficult to use typical reductionist science to disprove some of the claims that he's made.
If we throw out the work that he's done, just for the sake of conversation, and you take your knowledge of what you've looked at for the past 30, 40 years in Australia, a place like that, a brittle landscape, irregular rainfall, if you wanted to regenerate drylands, but there has to be, let's say there was an economic incentive to get somebody to do this. So somebody's got to graze animals on here that they can sell at the end of the day to make it work versus the government just saying, hey, we'll just do it this way and we'll fund you and cost is no object. So if somebody had an economic model to work to regenerate a dry land, how would you go about doing so?
People have actually done this already. There are a number of very innovative young pastoralists or ranchers in Australia that have done this. And their technique is really, first of all, they're generally fairly well educated. They've got a university degree. That's not to say that if you need a university degree to do this, but they embrace technology. They're always looking at climate models to try and predict what's happening. They're very computer literate. And these folk work on the proposition that low risk stocking, in other words, reducing the number of livestock you run on the land, ends up giving you a better long-term productivity because you're maximizing the value that you get from the land rather than maximizing the value that you get from the livestock. I can remember a rangelands conference 20 years ago when this fellow got up and showed his data over the last 20 years where there were huge droughts. And because he was reduced, because his carrying capacity, no, not the carrying capacity, his livestock, the number of livestock he was running was something like 20% less, fewer than adjoining. He was able to, his production was fairly constant. It was moving up and down a little bit compared to his neighbors who were living in a boom and bust scenario. And the expression boom and bust is often used to describe the Australian landscape. We go from huge rainfall years, last 3 or 4 years, we've just moved out of one now, and we're moving into probably another bust. Landholders that are working in this boom and bust environment really fall into two camps. They're either putting on a lot of livestock when there's a lot of grass, or they're maintaining a steady number of livestock over time. So you're asking me how I would go about restoring these systems. I think there's definitely a place for livestock in restoration because they do a lot of great stuff. You've just got to manage the numbers. You've also got to control feral herbivores. Now, this is highly contentious again, and we have kangaroos in Australia, which are, I guess, an analog or similar to what you might have in other countries like wild ungulates. And they're very efficient at breeding and they're very efficient at removing biomass. So most graziers, pastoralists will, need to manage wild herbivores as well as managing domestic herbivores. What can I say?
Will a wild herbivore retard the system from advancing? Because
really high during droughts and in really high densities, yes, they will. But in average years, no. So I was involved in a huge grazing study at 450 sites over a large area of Eastern Australia. And we found that kangaroos had no effect on soil health. They had no effect on pastoral production. They had no effect on reducing fire risk. They basically were quite benign in this landscape. The problems you get with feral herbivores is when you overgraze with livestock and then livestock are competing with kangaroos or rabbits, and that's when you get into trouble. So if you're running sustainable levels of livestock grazing, and that usually means fewer livestock than what the system can take, then you've got grass that will recover much more quickly. You're not destroying the structure of the soil. You've got a more resilient system that's likely to bounce back after drought. And that's been proven by a number of these innovative young pastoralists, particularly in Western Australia.
Hey there, tired of spending forever seeding nursery trays by hand? Meet the Quick Click Drop Seeder. It makes seeding trays super fast. Just a click and you're done. You can seed multiple trays in no time, making your nursery work way easier. Plus, it works with paper pot trays, microgreens, and any other tray that you have. Say goodbye to tedious seeding and hello to more time on the farm. Join hundreds of other farmers and try the Quick Click Seeder today. Available at shop.moderngrower.co or using the link below.